Having lots of money.
Preparations for the Southern Cross International Rally start weeks, even months before the event. Manufacturers treat the Southern Cross as a major proving ground. GMH, in support of their Marlborough Holden dealer team, were relying on the turbocharged Gemini, now with a redesigned, stronger drivetrain, the brainchild of team manager George Shepherd. Nissan Datsun were running a three-car team of double overhead cam 2-litre Stanzas, the car that won the Southern Cross in 1978 and the tough East African Safari in 1979. Preparations were under the watchful eye of Nissan's Australian rally team manager, Howard Marsden.
Just got to change the front pens on the house and that's it.
The boys coming up, they had no troubles with them?
No, good.
Okay, Ralph, it's okay?
Everything was fine.
Ford imported Sweden's World Rally champion, Bjorn Waldegard, to head their three-car team.
Would anybody like a ride with Mr. Bjorn Waldegard around the circuit?
For the first time in Australia, this year we have elapsed timing, which puts the Southern Cross on a par with World Championship rallies. It's the accepted and standard international method of timing.
The Southern Cross has always attracted international interest, and drivers from Europe, Japan and the Pacific region regularly compete.
Longer than European events.
Entries are broken into 5 main classes, from special production vehicles to stock standard. And the specifications for each car are rigidly checked before the start, with special emphasis on safety aspects.
Start with your parking lights, please. Thank you. Low beam. Low beam. Right. High beam with driving lights. Jim. Bill. High beam. Right.
At 10 o'clock on Saturday, 13th of October, the cars lined up in Sydney Square. First car out, Bjorn Waldegard's Ford Escort, a brand new car set up to Australian specifications but very similar to his European Escort. Car 2, a Datsun Stanza, is driven by another top European, Rauno Aaltonen from Finland. Aaltonen won the Southern Cross in 1977 and drove one of the Stanzas into 6th place in the East African Safari in 1979. Few of Sydney's suburban drivers could have realised that they were driving alongside 2 of the world's top rally drivers. But that docile city driving soon gave way to precision speed out in the forests. Waldegard was obviously intent on setting an early lead, and was living up to his reputation as the world's fastest rally driver. This is the first time that a world champion has competed in an Australian rally, and the spectators were out in force to watch the competition between him and Datsun's Rano Aaltonen. But the Flying Finn wasn't being drawn into a speed battle. As he puts it, he doesn't attack early in an event and prefers to rely on the dependability of his car to even the score. Nonetheless, he still wasn't wasting any time. Car 3 carried the first of the Australian team entries, Greg Carr, in the second Ford Escort. Carr has a reputation as a very fast driver, and he was obviously out to match the world champion leading his team. Next, the current Australian rally champion, Ross Dunkerton, in the second factory-prepared Datsun Stanza. And Colin Bond, Ford's team manager, in the third Ford Escort. Bond won the Southern Cross back in 1972, but these days he concentrates more on supporting his team than on winning himself. Right on Bond's tail was the 1978 winner, George Fury, completing the Datsun Works entry. A quiet and unassuming Albury farmer, Fury seems to live up to his name only when he's behind the wheel of his rally car. French ace Jean-Paul Luc was taking his first look at Australian rallying in the rebuilt Nolde Celica, a veteran of the Repco round Australia, but the car didn't last and Luc was out on the second night. Wayne Bell, in the turbocharged Gemini, had a lot more speed at his disposal, but was hampered in the early stages by the slower Celica. Bell was looking for an opportunity to get around the Frenchman, but wasn't taking any foolish risks in the dusty conditions. Bell took third place in the 1978 Southern Cross when the Gemini was little more than standard. This time, with a turbocharger and a strengthened drivetrain, the Marlborough Holden dealer team was expecting even better from the little Gemini to follow their remarkable 1-2-3 win in the Repco round Australia. Behind the factory entries came the privateers, led by Victoria's Jeff Portman. His car, a Ford Cortina, and the Holden Commodore of Doug Stewart were both veterans of the Repco. And the most colourful of the privateers, Peter Jansen, in a Saab, the captain, as he's known in motoring circles. As night fell, the works mechanics literally swarmed over the leading cars. Datsun in particular provides an impressive mobile service setup capable of almost any repair in the field. Though not as strong numerically, the Ford mechanics too can virtually rebuild a car on the spot. But the main task is to replace the worn tyres. Under these incredibly rough conditions, tyres are changed after every competitive stage, and a great deal of thought goes into the tread pattern required for each condition. Both Datsun and Ford were running on Dunlop rubber, but they'd each selected different compounds and tread patterns. Waldegard was using soft European-type tyres, which gave him the edge in speed, but provided little distance.
Very soft compound tyres over a couple of special stages, totaling about 60 kilometres in length, and as you can see there's very little left of them, just on the point of bursting through the canvas.
27.53. That was
The drivers take advantage of these breaks to catch up on the opposition placings. When the tough night stages began, the field quickly dwindled. Waldegard was still setting a furious pace out in front. With Altonen's Datsun still dogging his heels, not matching the champion's times, but staying well within reach. Then came George Fury, now up in third place. With his teammate, Ross Dunkerton, right behind him. 3 Datsuns, worrying the leading Ford Escort. Greg Carr came through the creek crossing on one wheel rim. He made it to control, but his drivetrain gave up under the strain soon after. Ford's team leader, Colin Bond, also had his share of trouble with a broken axle that cost him half an hour, plus the odd miscalculation in the corners. But the worst luck was reserved for Wayne Bell. His Gemini was really flying, and he looked set to surprise the leaders when something in his clutch let go, and he ground to a halt in the middle of the last competitive stage, just short of Port Macquarie, where George Shepherd waited to greet him.
The car was going well. He had a bit of troubles in the first few earlier sections with a slower car in front of him, which was holding him up with the dust, and then once he got past that, he was putting up times which were competitive with the top 3 or 4. We had a failure in the clutch area somewhere. We're not sure exactly what, but it would seem that we've broken the clutch inside the centre of the clutch, and of course that's put him out of the rally, which is rather disappointing.
A major spectator display was planned for the second afternoon just out of Port Macquarie. But Jorn Waldegard took a short cut, and the spectators were disappointed. Officials then parked a control car across the escape road so that the following cars couldn't do the same. This pleased the spectators, but meant that the results of that section could be subject to protest, so it was dropped from the official calculations. However, the 3 Datsuns put up quite a display for the crowd, and the section, though not counting in the results, proved worthwhile anyway. George Fury was in second place at this stage, after times had been counted overnight. With Rano Altonen 56 seconds behind him in third place. Waldegard had an 8-minute lead on the Datsuns, but there were 3 of them behind him, and he needed only one large mistake, and they'd be past him. The Australian champion, Ross Dunkerton, was holding his position in 4th, so the 3 Datsuns were poised, ready for any mistake by the leader. Sydney privateer Frank Neal was in 5th place at this stage and going really well, only to strike mechanical trouble late that night, forcing his retirement. With 8 minutes up his sleeve, Waldegard had now slackened his pace a little, no doubt quite conscious of the Datsuns right behind him. He was obviously getting the feel of these forest conditions before cracking on the pace again. His European rival, Rano Altonen, has a distinct advantage in that he's been rallying in Australia since the days of the Mini and knows the Port Macquarie area well. He could afford to keep his foot down. So too could his teammates, Fury and Dunkerton. Wayne Bell had joined the spectators by this time and seemed to be enjoying the new experience. It was a new experience too for Colin Bond to be back in 15th place. Into the night, and Waldegarde's escort stayed well out in front. He'd brought his regular navigator, Hans Thorzelius, and he too seemed quite at home with the Australian conditions and regulations. The Swedish champion had actually extended his lead slightly in the previous sections, and the Australians were beginning to wonder whether they could ever catch him. George Fury and Monty Suffin are a particularly fast combination in these tight mountain roads, but they were hard-pressed to keep the margin from widening, let alone make up ground on the world champion.
How's it going, Monty? You still got the clock stopped?
No, sorry.
Cards?
26:34. Yeah.
But George Fury, despite the pressure, still obliged with autographs for the youngsters who seemed to turn up in the most isolated places, while the man he was chasing relaxed at the surface area nearby. The Datsun mechanics anxiously waited for their charge.
What tires are we putting in now?
Which ones do you... We got... What's this? We got the other soft ones to do. You want soft or hard? Because I think you've only got a short one.
Wait a second, 38k? How many minutes that go? No, a beer compound.
The soft ones.
Beer. Do we have beer?
When Fury arrived, the Datsun mechanics swept into their well-oiled routine, checking every nut and bolt to make sure that nothing goes wrong. It's probably in this area, more than anything, that rallying provides value for the general public. The cars are subjected to strains they may never encounter under family car conditions, and the smallest weakness is soon identified, remedied, and the answer built into succeeding models, while tyre manufacturers like Dunlop continually improve their product.
Oh, that was a bit hard, 88 kilometres of it, and mostly pretty tight and a bit dusty in places you can't see in the distance. Yeah. And it wasn't too bad by and large though.
How's the car going?
Oh, the car's going like a train. The driver's getting a bit tired.
But if George Fury was tired, Ross Dunkerton and his navigator, Jeff Beaumont, looked exhausted.
Car number 4.
The route codes?
Oh, yeah, thanks, mate.
Ross still obliged with autographs, but the strain of the last section was plainly visible.
We have a rest or a 12-hour break or something now, do we?
Got service.
Did George have a tent in the backyard?
As Dunkerton rolled into the service area, the Datsun officials were discussing the route instructions with the opposition. Waldegarde and Thorzelius were having a few problems understanding the instructions and were later to strike real problems. But Dunkerton had his own to worry about.
Well, that would have been the worst section of the rally, I would say. We
I overshot it.
In what way, the dust?
No, very, very slippery.
A couple of times could have gone off very badly. We overshot one corner, which we had to go back on, and also we dropped the passage control card, so I reckon we probably did 45 seconds more than we should have done.
5:17.
The flying Finn Rano Aaltonen had also had his share of problems and was now behind Ross Dunkerton. He'd also taken a wrong road apparently and lost more time than Ross. In international rallying, seconds count.
Every picture tells a story.
Late in the night, the first signs of trouble. George Fury came through first. Rano Aaltonen was next. With Ross Dunkerton again behind him. Then Waldegaard. He'd taken a wrong turn. But now he had his teammate Colin Bond back up in 5th place. Waldegaard later appealed against the route instructions successfully. But by the 4th and final day, the young Albury farmer George Fury had again taken a narrow lead.
How are we doing, all right? We're in the lead at the moment, but how long we'll hold is another story.
This wet weather give you an advantage, John, being a European driver?
I don't think so. I mean, I do very many rallies a year, and we find wet and slippery condition quite often. So you have just to alternate the driving style to the condition.
You've been in there all night.
Ross Dunkerton was back in his normally high spirits, but he sobered a little when reminded that he was still chasing the world champion.
How do you feel about the wet conditions tonight? I don't know. It's sort of, with Waldegaard having driven on ice and snow, I think that he will take time off us.
A real Datsun fan club had gathered to provide the team with moral support as Rano Aaltonen prepared his car for the night ahead. This was to be the ultimate test. There wasn't quite so much strain among the backmarkers. In fact, some of them seemed to enjoy real luxury out on the rally track. But for the factory entries out in the lead, it's a very serious business, with the car buying public watching the results closely. George Fury's Datsun Stanza had a narrow lead to maintain. Jorn Waldegaard, the world rally champion, had his reputation to maintain. He is the fastest rally driver in the world and was eager to regain the lead for Ford. Ross Dunkerton had regained 3rd place over his teammate Aaltonen. But now, Aaltonen had switched his strategy to attack, which provided the spectators with some fine examples of car control. Colin Bond in the other Ford Escort was back in 5th place. No real danger to the front runners, but eager to take 4th place from Aaltonen. Late at night, the pressure was really on. Fury passed this point only 10 seconds ahead of Waldegaard. The Swedish champion was pulling out all the stops in his pursuit of the Australian and was ready to pounce. Ross Dunkerton was slipping back from the leaders and could do little to support his teammate, while Rano Aaltonen was fighting his own battle with Colin Bond for 4th place. By the time George Fury arrived at the last main service point, Tension among the spectators was electric. Had he managed to hold off the challenge? And where was Waldegard anyway? The escort should have arrived right behind Fury Stanza if he was going to take the lead in this last competitive section. Fury seemed quite untroubled by the tension and quietly accepted a hot drink as if he hadn't a care in the world. Then came the news that shattered the hopes of the Ford supporters and the mechanics that waited to service Waldegard's car. What's happened to Bjorn Waldegard?
He's failed differential.
What, in section?
Yeah, in one of the long sections, yeah.
As he arrived, Ross Dunkerton confirmed the news.
Last time we saw him was on the side of the road with what we think is a broken crown wheel pinion. He was about 20k at the end of the section.
So it was virtually all over. But there was still some worry about Rano Aaltonen.
How far is Rano behind us, you know?
He hasn't come in yet.
What, now how far are we running behind you?
About 9 minutes, I suppose.
Did he hit something or you haven't been told anything precise?
Stand by, base to main 3. Main 3? Yes, did Rano hit anything or is there any further information on that front end damage?
No, he said that he thought he had been steering. I had a look, I couldn't see anything, couldn't see any damage or anything being bent or twisted anywhere.
Fury's navigator, Monty Suffin, had a few minor points to check before they entered the last competitive section, but provided they made no major mistakes, they could be assured of a second successive win in the Southern Cross. When Aaltonen arrived, the Datsun mechanics closely checked his front suspension and steering, as Ross Dunkerton drove out in second place. This could be a 1-2-3 win for Nissan Datsun. But Colin Bond's escort was due any minute, and he could challenge Rano Aaltonen. Aaltonen also confirmed Waldegard's fate.
Steering center is good, correct?
Yes, correct, yes. And he was just sitting on the side of a car and waving happily to us when we passed. Not doing any work at all.
Sounds like he's broken whatever it is in a big way.
Like he's immobile, yes.
When Colin Bond arrived, the Ford mechanics began a meticulous check of his car. With Waldegard out, all their hopes now rested with Colin Bond, and they were making sure that his car would reach the finish. Not surprisingly, the mechanics paid close attention to Bond's differential and drivetrain. Both Carr and Waldegard had been put out of the event because of rear axle problems, but the team manager's car seemed to be free of trouble. The Ford was now about 15 minutes behind the third Datsun, but with the longest section of the rally coming up, 215 kilometres in 3 hours, they still had a chance. By this time, the strain was beginning to show everywhere. And it was a great relief to see daylight as the cars made their final dash into Port Macquarie. The positions were still the same, but the margins were a little different. George Fury was 13 minutes ahead of his teammate Dunkerton. Aaltonen was 1 hour, 4.5 minutes behind him. And then Bond, now only 11 minutes from Aaltonen's tail. Frank Johnson was in 5th place, the popping and banging Mazda RX-3 still belying its sound. While Doug Stewart had amazed everyone by bringing the ex-Repco Commodore home in 7th place, despite a severely limited service backup. But the day and the Southern Cross Rally belonged to the Datsuns. Like the Commodores in the Repco, they took the flag 1, 2, 3, with the young farmer George Fury the hero.
For 1979, comes George Fury and Monty Suffin and the Datsun Stanza.
It's Datsun's 3rd Southern Cross and Fury's 2nd, a victory shared with his regular and hard-working navigator, Monty Suffin.
And Denise and Harvey awarding the laurels of the winner to Monty Suffin. No dealing the roof there, George. Let's hear it for them.